Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Veil background information. We're doing a creature profile and we're still in the sea monsters realm at the moment, so we're going to be talking about Jormungandr and Ouroboros, which I sort of left out in other things. So, as always, you'll get a quote from story where something's mentioned, then you'll get the background information I have for it that I've used, and then you'll get my creature profile. So, let's get into it. So the entire archipelago is maintained by the actions of a world serpent. Damn it, I always knew there was something weird about us, and I reckon we're further out into the Pacific than Hawaii. A quote from Reciprocity. Now, I mentioned previously that the Ouroboros was part of the snake grouping, but I linked them to the Jormungandr group for a very important reason. But we'll start with one of my favourite stories about the beast Jormungandr, and this is my interpretation of mythology that's come from a lot of child-friendly mythology books on Norse mythology and mythology on the whole. So this is my culmination from years growing up enjoying this mythology, but seriously, you can check everywhere for the same story. So amongst the pantheon of Norse gods was the fire giant Loki, trickster god and blood brother to Odin, adopted into Asgard. Now Loki was a god that, although he had an incredibly loving wife in Asgard, was still affected by his giant blood, which is said to be tainted by the poison of the Illivergard. He couldn't be content. He couldn't be content. He had to be involved in everything, and he had to be doing something that might be frowned upon. Amongst his little troubles were his dalliances with the giant Angrboda, a very dangerous giantess with a chaotic nature. Now, some stories suggest that they together were the parents of Gerda, a giantess so beautiful that Frey gave up the only weapon that could defeat her in order to marry her. But most stories stick with the birth of the three hideous monsters. The first was the wolf cub Fenrir. The third was a daughter that was beautiful on the top half and a rotting corpse below. Hell. But in the middle was the great serpent Jormungandr. Each of these held a destiny to become the rival and killer god. Jormungandr would be the deadly foe of Thor. Now, the Midgaard serpent, his secondary name, was a greedy being that was desperate to consume anything and everything it could, always hungry, and thus to try and stop its growth, its tail was forced into its mouth, and it was hurled into the sea, where it became large enough to surround the whole of Midgard and continued to get bigger. Legend stated if its tail ever fell out of its mouth, the world would be destroyed, as its great coils kept Midgard surrounded in water and forced the waves and the treacherous deep seas. The serpent would remain waiting until the day of Ragnarok, wherein he will release his tail from his mouth, let the world crumble away, and the seas mix to let the ship of the dead arrive at Asgard. He will fight forth, though killed, his poisoned blood will take out the beloved thunder god. In fact, of all the varying foes Thor fights, Jormungandr constantly turns up in stories as trouble for him. There is the story of him in the halls of the Giant King, who is also a magician. Thor is showing off his strength and must lift up the giant's cat. Thor manages to lift one paw and later learns that he was in fact wrestling the Jormungandr and almost pulled his tail from his mouth. In another story, Thor is out fishing with Tyr's stepfather Hymir, and is so annoyed of the foul manner of the fellow, who seems to be insisting Thor can't handle fishing like he can, and even refused to give him bait for his line. Thus, to prove his might, Thor used his hammer to take the head off of one of Hymir's ox and used that to catch whales. Feeling proud of himself, Thor insists they go to deeper water, even though Hymir advises against it, and thus Thor snags a particularly fearsome fish. Of course, Thor pulls it right up out of the water to reveal it is Jormungandr with its tail still in his mouth, but also the bait and hook. Thor almost thinks to take the chance to kill it, even though its poisonous slime and bodily fluids, referred to as attar, are pouring into the water around it. But Hymir cuts the line, stopping Thor from risking Ragnarok or destroying the world with the serpent. In the story, Jormungandr is supposed to be powerful and terrible, incredibly strong, and yet constantly Thor proves he can pull him up, but manages just in time to seemingly accept some humility and drop him. Jormungandr almost seems to act like the warning to Thor's own ego. The more he pushes, the more at risk he is of destroying the world. But when he accepts he should drop the rod, for instance, he thus released the serpent. Now, details on what it looks like vary from something eel-like or worm-like, which often translates to draconic. Certainly the Midgard serpent is drawn as the traditional sea serpent with the humping coils seen on maps. Certainly, Jormungandr is a terrifying thing, and well, it's an interesting creature, and no doubt has been the origin of the serpents and markings on maps denoting here be dragons, as Jormungandr's body was thought to denote the very edge of the world. Now, his name is thought to translate roughly from Norse to big monster. Spellings vary with umlauts and r's that English dictionaries don't always allow, but certainly the pronunciation is always with the r at the end, like gander, in most cases. Now, with the image of the encircling serpent eating itself, the Jormungandr is a perfect example of an Ouroboros. Now, generally, most hear the story of the Ouroboros as a draconic worm that became ever hungry and decided it would devour itself. Thus it is depicted in the perfect ring devouring its tail. Like Jormungandr, in my understand it is a way to check Thor's pride. The Ouroboros is often referred to in warning of people that are always in want to the point they are never satisfied. Ouroboros is thought to translate into tail eating, and the image is often connected more with a symbol of the life circle, eternity, and well, it's got a place in all sorts of different texts and interpretations. It is linked to Egyptian mythology with the reference to Ra and Osiris within the underworld, and a link to the transition of death to life and the constancy. The eternal thought that the sun will always rise and always set, and the circular motion of our world is often seen within the image of the Ouroboros. And it's actually not often used for gluttonous or greed elements, except in more modern interpretations. I certainly remember it being mentioned in Channel 4's Merlin series from the 90s as a warning to King Vortigern, but the Ouroboros is never really spoken of as a particular individual being, despite the fact in modern bestiaries it is. In fact, I think there's some interweaving with the Jormungandr, as certainly it is associated, but also with the worm, the lindworm that I mentioned, would spin after people by biting their tails. Either way, it's a curious symbol indeed. Now, within the Vale, these beings are held under the same banner, that of the Ouroboros, and generally they are not seen in human form. So these guys really are just sea monsters. So side unclear, created by demons, created for no particular reason, created when before the Vale. Physical description: huge titanic serpentine beasts with gills and fishy frills that could easily be called a sea serpent. They are often seen with their tails in their mouths and their bodies coiling to create whirlpools and netting for their prey. Abilities: they are huge and strong. They can bring down boats and whales, but stick to deep waters where they are hard to see. They have poisonous blood and fangs that aid them in taking on other sea beasts like the cetus and leviathans, most known for sticking their tails in their mouths as they are devouring one another. Weaknesses: they are mortal, but their armour is pretty thick, and as they're quite venomous, they're hard to take out. Number unclear. They are rarely seen. Well-known beings: the biggest one spotted in the waters of north of Norway that is often titled Jormungandr. Characters and stories: none currently that they are mentioned. Final comments: they're interesting beings within the Vale waters, but rarely seen except at the worst times, so they're often a portent of doom. So thank you for listening.